On May 23rd, user MSLoan98 posted this video.
Belgium, quietly sitting in the corner when people discuss war crimes, hoping people remember them for chocolate and waffles, not the time they killed 13 million Africans in the late 1800s.
Well, I remember, especially since, speaking of chocolates, I grew up with these. And if you don't get why that's so sinister right now, you will by the end of this video. Hello one and all, I'm Tanita D and this is D-Dives, a place where I talk about whatever's piqued my interest. Today, that is the continued colonization of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I know it's not the most feel-good subject, but as tough and uncomfortable as it is, it deserves to be talked about. See, although the myth behind Antwerp's chocolate hands is one of triumph and victory, of good over evil, there's also another intentionally overlooked side of Belgian history associated with severed hands. A history that conceals one of the biggest mass murders in modern history and tries to forget one of the biggest crimes perpetrated by a European country on African peoples. So get comfortable because we're diving right in. The Democratic Republic of Congo has long been plagued with instability, exploitation, violence, and poverty, but that's been by design, from the first Europeans who set foot in Central Africa till now. For example, see, from 1880 to 1910, Belgian King Leopold II imposed such a barbaric regime of terror in the Congo that it got international outcry from other colonial powers.
Leopold effectively turned all of the Congo into a slave plantation. The red rubber system led to the collapse of economic and cultural life for the Congolese. A system so cruel that female hostages often starved while men were worked to death. Those that tried to flee into forests often died of hunger. Tens of thousands were shot in failed uprisings, and because farming had been disrupted, local Congolese were susceptible to famine and disease.
And although some scholars say that what happened in the Congo was not, strictly speaking, a genocide, it certainly caused a death toll of Holocaust proportions. So to understand what's happening in DRC today, we've got to understand its past, and understanding that past means reckoning with the abject horror the Congolese were and are subjected to. And to do that, we've got to rewind a bit. The Democratic Republic of Congo may be the second largest African country and 11th largest in the world, but it's important to remember that its borders were imposed by late 19th century European colonialism. For the people who had lived there thousands upon thousands of years prior, they meant nothing. In fact, prior to European contact, the wealthy and advanced Kingdom of Congo flourished along the south side of the Congo River. Fast forward to 1483, where Portuguese explorers make contact with the kingdom and immediately become aware of its profit-making potential. They realized that the Congo could supply valuable raw materials like elephant tusks and human bodies. So the Portuguese started shipping enslaved Congolese off to the Americas and did so until the 19th century, where various European colonial powers started vying for control over Africa's territories and resources. With that, the scramble for Africa was on. Europeans had seen how the enslaved had made the plantation economy boom in the Americas and wanted a piece for their own industrial revolution. Among them were the Belgians, or really I should say, their king, Leopold II, 37 years old at the time. He became fixated on having a colony because, well, he was fixated on the idea of getting rich. Really rich. He literally told an advisor once, quote, "Belgium doesn't exploit the world. It's a taste we've got to make her learn." Yeah, so noting the disgust Europeans felt towards Arab slavers, ironic really, and writing on the importance of bringing Christianity and civilization to the savages of Africa, Leopold established himself as a philanthropist and anti-slavery crusader. He created a so-called humanitarian organization called the International African Association and enlisted the services of a man named Henry Morton Stanley to set up bases along the Congo River. But behind all of his talks of humanitarian policies, free trade, and scientific enterprises, Leopold had but one goal: collecting treasure, ivory to be more exact. And who was to collect that ivory? The Congolese. And when Leopold realized the treasure trove he stumbled across, one that people were getting worked to death over, him and his lawyers came up with arrangements that would grant his private company, yeah, the humanitarian organization I just talked about, the right to act as a sovereign country. And the way he got local chiefs to agree to it was by getting his henchman, Stanley, to coerce more than 450 of them to sell their land for almost nothing. It's important important to note that most of these chiefs had no idea what they were signing. Few of them had seen written word before, but Stanley made big promises about how they were there to help the country level up, and big claims like the one that whites had supernatural powers, and so with that, Leopold II legally got the land he wanted. The legal part was important because that meant that during the 1884 Berlin Conference, the one where European leaders carved out Africa to seize its lands for their own gain, he could defend his grip on the Congo to other colonial powers and ultimately keep it. Essentially, he was all, this is mine, and I've got the papers to prove it, and the other leaders were like, okay, yeah, well, let's get back to deciding which country on this huge continent is ours with no input or regard for the indigenous populations, because that would be crazy, and we just don't care. Being a white man's great. And so, in 1885, Leopold II formally established the Congo Free State, installed himself as the absolute monarch, and with that, the colonized Congo Kingdom had effectively become his own property. Two things to note here. Not only was the Congo Free State 76 times the size of Belgium, but Leopold II had never set foot in it, and he never would. But what he sure did was make sure it became one of the bloodiest European colonies in Africa.
Soyez les bienvenus dans notre grande patrie du Congo belge. La tâche qui vous est confiée de remplir.
Because there was so much to exploit, I mean, the Congo was and is very rich, Leopold's new captives were subjected to an inhumane system of rubber, ivory, and mineral extraction.
The Congo Free State became anything but free for the people that lived there. A worldwide boom in rubber meant that Leopold II could cash in big time. But tapping rubber from trees was back-breaking work.
A system that, mind you, built buildings in Belgium like Ter Vuren's Musée Royal. Yes, Belgium's Royal Museum of Central Africa was built with the brutal, unpaid labor of Congolese people, but I digress. To wield control over the native population and impose their regime of terror, Leopold's colonial administration systematically used mutilation, rape, and mass killings as punishment when extraction quotas weren't met or when the enslaved refused to work. See, to increase his profits, Leopold had issued a series of decrees that stated that all land and products of the land were his and his only. Furthermore, he shut out any other potential traders and set up a private army to make sure all profits went back to him. This was all done under the guise of humanitarian and altruistic motivation, but profit was really the bottom line, and all this did was incentivize violence because the only way to get the local populations to work for profit at their own expense was through force. The Congolese were regularly worked to death, and at the slightest offense, they were beaten with the shikut, a whip made from dried hippo skin. To give you an idea of just how cruel this was, 25 lashes caused people to faint, where 100 lashes killed them. And to really paint a picture of the callousness of the colonial regime, an account reads that a group of children was given 25 lashes for simply laughing in the presence of a white man. So for those like me who've heard, "Je vais te chicoter," guess where that comes from? And Leopold's private army was just another facet of these atrocious and inhumane conditions that the Congolese were subjected to. Called the Force Publique, this private army was essentially created to impose Leopold's rule on local populations. Made up of white officers, black soldiers who had been forced into service, and abducted children, the Force Publique enforced rubber quotas and suppressed frequent uprisings. Brutally, may I add. See, the Force Publique was an instrument of terror. They burned down villages, flogged people, slaughtered families of rebels, routinely raped women and girls, and cut the limbs of Congolese people. Remember Antwerp's chocolate hands? Well, the Congo Free State cut the hands, feet, and even heads of the Congolese if their rubber quotas weren't met. Right hands particularly were required from bodies. In fact, the state literally left instructions saying that, quote, "If they do not want to make rubber, you have to bring me the hands of those you have killed." But really, it didn't even matter if the person was dead or alive. Rubber quotas were so unrealistic that Congo Free State agents just started collecting hands as proof of death. Not to mention that for each bullet officers gave the Force Publique, they demanded proof that said bullet hadn't been wasted in hunting, so FP soldiers just started attacking villages to gather hands. These hands became a sort of currency, and FP soldiers were even paid their bonuses based on how many hands they collected. But for others, failure to meet rubber collection quotas was punishable by death, so Congo state officials began kidnapping people from different districts weeks and holding them hostage until the district chief brought in the required amount of rubber. Tips for taking hostages were even listed in state instruction books. Resistance was met with murder, and if the rubber haul didn't amount to the required total, people were whipped with the shikut. It's also important to note that the rape, sexual torture, and forced sexual slavery of Congolese women were amongst the most silenced crimes of this era. In fact, one could even say that the sexual torture tactics seen in DRC today have their roots in colonization.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo alone, 1.8 million women have been targets of brutal sexual assault. And today in the DRC, mass rapes are no longer confined to war zones. They've become routine.
I've read accounts that are too triggering for me to talk about here, but the experiences of the women of that time and now have been largely silenced. The torture of Native women and men was essentially used as a display of colonial power. I haven't even scratched the surface of all the atrocities that were committed during that time, but what I find interesting is that where today the West sees various forms of violence as only coming from African nations or what they deem to be third world countries, in the Congo, the most barbaric violence came from white people. Leopold II was not an anti-slavery crusader. He was the enslaver, and through his colonial regime, he set up such a horrific and unique form of cruelty that its remnants are still heavily felt to this day. From the comfort of his palace, Leopold II was effectively running a tyrannical slave colony. It's impossible to know just how many people were killed under his regime because of all the different forms of violence that were enacted at once, but estimates put that number at around 10 million people, or more than half of the Congolese population of the time. Through time, however, people started to catch on, notably people like George Washington Williams and Joseph Conrad, who had both witnessed firsthand the horror in the Congo and wrote about it. But governments really started paying attention some 23 years after King Leopold's reign had started, and it wasn't out of empathy, abject horror, or the kindness of their hearts. It was because of mass outrage. See, at the beginning of the 20th century, Edmund Morel, a British journalist, published damning evidence that directly contradicted what the Congo state press was saying. Yes, because through it all, King Leopold II kept pushing the narrative that he was simply helping the Congolese people and that all he was doing there was creating a better life for them. To prove it, he added a Congo greenhouse in his chateau and set up a living exhibit of more than 200 African people at the 1897 World Fair just to show how important the Belgians were in the advancement of these uncivilized barbarians. But unfortunately for him, Morel's articles and public speeches, coupled with images of burned down villages and children with missing hands, got the European public more and more agitated. Thanks to him, the British House of Commons passed a resolution urging the Congo state to, quote, govern with humanity, which is still quite ironic because, well, they were governing over a land they had no claim to whatsoever, but it was the first step in what would become the first international human rights movement of the 20th century. See, what King Leopold was doing in the Congo was too much even by colonial standards, and so, after international diplomatic pressure, Leopold II handed over his personal fiefdom to the Belgian parliament in 1908. Though, handed over isn't really the right word, because King Leopold actually sold his property. Yeah, the only way Leopold was going to give away his colony was if the Belgian government assumed $500 million worth of its debt, paid $230 million to complete his building projects, and gave him an additional $250 million worth as a mark of gratitude for his efforts in the country. The $1 billion he personally made in profit off the back of the colonized simply wasn't enough, huh? Not to mention that we'll never really know the true extent of his crimes because he destroyed documents and did a lot for all of it to remain shrouded in mystery.
When the Congo became a Belgian colony in 1908, Leopold ordered the burning of all state archives. To this day, few historians have written about that period.
He was truly the worst, but with that, King Leopold's reign of terror finally came to an end, and sadly, another one started. See, after decades of mass murder, torture, and exploitation, the Congolese still remained victims of Belgian colonization. So when one asks, how can one of the richest countries in the world simultaneously be one of its poorest? Well, you've got part of your answer. Although King Leopold II handed over the Congo to the Belgian government, keywords here being handed over because, again, none of them had any rightful claim to this land, the now Belgian Congo was still colonial in nature. In fact, the Belgian Congo fueled Belgian economic development. While the Congo's rubber, mineral resources, and agricultural products were being plundered, Belgium was lining its pockets, something that can still be seen to this day. External colonial interests have always hindered DRC's progress and actually explains a lot of what's happening today, but more on that later. The Belgian government was, of course, quite happy with its newly acquired colony. The Congolese people, however, not so much. To squash this, Belgian colonizers started trying to repress revolts by using the age-old divide-and-conquer technique and bribing local kings to betray their own subjects. But still, anti-colonial resistance forged ahead. In the 1950s, three factions of Congolese society came together to fight for independence. The first were African chiefs and professional soldiers. The second was the Kimbanguist movement, a religious movement founded by a Baptist prophet named Simon Kimbangu, who preached liberation from colonial rule. And the third were workers who demanded better wages and working conditions. With leadership from the so-called évolués, or educated Congolese elites, they joined forces to rally for independence. And the Belgian administration simply couldn't handle the number of, quote, problematic incidents that these protests incurred, and so they started looking the other way, which only emboldened the Congolese some more. Running such a big country required big control, which the local administrators simply couldn't keep up with. The increased discontent, rightful rage really, of the Congolese simply couldn't be contained anymore, and the increased bureaucratization of the Belgian administration actually further made it difficult to do so. Rural populations started protesting Belgian rule like never before and joining newly minted political parties like the Parti Solidaire Africain and Abaco, which spoke up and fought for the Congolese people. It all came to a head in January 4th, 1959, where an uprising in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, left an estimated 300 people dead. The Belgian government had tried erasing calls for independence, but in that moment realized that independence was only a matter of time. The Congo had become ungovernable and, more importantly, unprofitable, and thus on the 30th of June 1960, the Belgian Congo finally became independent.
La foule indigène manifeste sa joie tout au long du parcours. Voici venu le jour solennel de la proclamation de l'indépendance congolaise. Le roi, accompagné du président Kasavubu, se rend au palais de la nation.
But I'd venture to say independent in name only, because the Congo was simply too rich to let off the hook. Global powers still wanted a piece of it, and that included the Belgians, who did everything in their power to make it so that the new Republic of the Congo would still need to rely on them in the foreseeable future.
Car cette indépendance du Congo, c'est par la lutte qu'elle a été conquise.
See, when the Belgians agreed to decolonize in 1959, they gave extremely short notice. Not only that, but unlike other European colonial powers, the Belgian administration had never hired, much less trained, Congolese officials, which meant that no Congolese local had experience with running the state. Their goal was to have a weak, independent Congo that they could keep bending to their whim. So when Patrice Lumumba popped up, they weren't too happy and made sure to get rid of him. See, after independence, Patrice Lumumba, a Congolese nationalist, was elected as the first prime minister.
Congolais et Congolaises, combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date illustre que vous garderez ineffaçablement gravée dans vos cœurs, une date dont vous enseignerez avec fierté la signification à vos enfants, pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de notre lutte pour la liberté.
To speak on such a revered and important figure in Congolese history would take me hours, if not days, so I'm just gonna give you the big lines. See, amongst other things, Lumumba wanted to unify the Congo by eliminating tribalism and regionalism, but that sadly never materialized because due to the power vacuum the Belgians had left, tribal leaders suddenly found themselves more powerful than Lumumba's government. And with that, the Congo crisis began. Two of the country's most affluent provinces, Katanga and Kasai, attempted to secede, and some units of the Congolese army started rebelling because of the fact that their commanders were Belgian, which understandable. But this meant that Lumumba was stuck. His army was divided, his administration untrained, and his political alliances were very shaky. So he did what he could to remedy the situation. He appealed to the United Nations for help, asking them to expel the Belgians and help suppress the revolts, but they refused. Quite condescendingly, may I add. So Lumumba looked for help elsewhere, and he found it in the Soviet Union. It's important to note that around that time, the Cold War was in full bloom, so this move in the eyes of the West was a big no-no. So big that the UN, along with Belgian officials and the US, began plotting Lumumba's murder. They were worried that the Congo would become a Soviet ally and in turn make it harder for them to extract its resources. So they started essentially painting Lumumba as a genocidal maniac to justify his elimination. They compared his ideology of Pan-Africanism to fascism, linked him to Hitler, and set about trying to replace him with a moderate, aka someone they could manipulate more easily for their own profit. So Patrice Lumumba was dismissed as prime minister in September 1960, replaced by Moïse Tshombe, and placed under house arrest in October 1960. But that seemingly wasn't enough. Lumumba's popularity was deemed such a threat that in January 1961, he was killed by a firing squad in direct contact with Belgian officials. That is, in and of itself, a whole other wild and heartbreaking story, but with Lumumba's assassination, the Congo crisis came to an end, and another one started. The US wasn't done interfering in the Congo, namely because it had become a proxy for the Cold War, and they needed someone who would look out for their interests. So in the name of stability, they helped a colonel named Joseph Désiré Mobutu stage a coup that propelled him into power in 1965. Thus began an era of economic destabilization, exploitation, and widespread corruption.
Je suis rentré pas pour m'occuper des intérêts de Mobutu, mais des intérêts supérieurs du Zaire.
Although Mobutu renamed the country the Republic of Zaire, a local term for the Congo River, and vowed to purge the country of all colonial era influences, it was all a front. All his efforts were supported by the West.
President Mobutu and I have just had a warm and useful discussion, and I am pleased to have been able to meet again with President Mobutu, who's been a faithful friend of the United States for some 20 years. And I am confident that the close relations between our two countries, based on shared interests and perceptions, will advance the cause of peace and development in Africa. And we're very pleased to have him visit us once again, as he did a year and a half ago.
He also built close ties with the apartheid government of South Africa and Israel, so there's that. But anyways, Mobutu was basically the ruler of a kleptocracy, amassing huge amounts of personal wealth and selling out his own country to line his pockets and those of the ruling elite. While him and his crew were living large, the economy collapsed, inflation soared, and starvation skyrocketed to the point that by 1975, the country was in absolute tatters. Zaire had never been about or for the people. It had been for Mobutu. But ironically, the Western forces that had put Mobutu in power would also be those who brought him back down. Never trust the colonial hand that feeds you, I guess. Up till then, Mobutu had only been able to maintain his control with support from the US and other Western powers. But once the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 90s, the US didn't really see a reason to rally behind Mobutu anymore. The Cold War was over and communism was no longer a threat, so with their interests safe and sound, they essentially threw him away like days-old trash. Mobutu tried clinging on to power by proposing political reforms, but they went nowhere because he wasn't inclined in the slightest to relinquish his authority. Realizing that Mobutu was determined to hold on to power though, civil unrest started brewing in Zaire, not to mention that in neighboring countries of Rwanda and Uganda, things were taking a turn for the worse.
Ice go! Ice go! Ice go! Ade!
All All the different elements I just mentioned resulted in what is now known as the First Congo War. Getting into the details would again take me days, so I'll give you a brief overview. See, in the 1960s, ethnic tensions in Rwanda forced millions of Tutsis to flee to neighboring countries, one of them being the DRC. I'm skipping over a whole lot of details here, but essentially, Rwanda had once been home to two amicable ethnic groups, the Hutus and Tutsis. However, Belgian colonization pitted these two groups against each other by turning the Tutsis into the ruling elite. This led to a Hutu uprising, which led to a Tutsi ethnic cleansing, which in turn led to the Rwandan genocide of 1994. This genocide only stopped when soldiers of the Tutsi diaspora took control of the country, but what's important to note for this story is that after the Tutsis rose to power, 1 million Hutus fled over the border to Zaire. Why is that important? Well, because their presence in the Congo gave both Rwanda and Uganda and their allies an excuse to enter Zaire. Thus, in 1996, in the name of border security, a coalition force led by exiled Congolese rebel and Tutsi ally Laurent Désiré Kabila invaded Zaire to overthrow Mobutu.
The root of the war in Congo can be traced back to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. As the Rwandan Patriotic Front took power, the genocidal forces fled into eastern Congo and found refuge under former dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. In 1997, Rwanda and Uganda used Laurent Kabila to overthrow Mobutu.
But as with a lot of the motivations I've talked about thus far in this video, the real reason these forces invaded the Congo was for its natural resources. I say that because, again, in the name of border security, Rwandan troops allegedly massacred thousands of Hutus, forcefully repatriated Tutsis, and took control of very lucrative diamond and coltan mines in the eastern region bordering Rwanda.
Nchi yetu ina mali mingi sawa vile nchi za kigeni zinakuya kuiba mali yetu.
Not to mention that these forces were given the go-ahead by the US, who had once more decided to intervene with its own interests in mind. So with that, Mobutu fled the country on May 16, 1997, and just one day later, Kabila declared himself president. He renamed the country to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in an effort to be seen as president in his own right, he cut off ties with his Rwandan and Ugandan allies, which only angered them, and so in 1998, they invaded the Congo once more, thus kicking off the Second Congo War. I think you've noticed throughout all of this that the Congo and its people have never really been able to catch a break. The country has always been in the middle of various actors fighting over its resources, vying over power to the detriment of local populations. You truly hate to see it.
Mali yetu tuko nayo ndio biko wanatupiganisha juu ya wanapenda watubagabule nchi yetu mara pili.
With the Second Congo War, during the first 2 years alone, about 1,700,000 Congolese lives were claimed. See, because Kabila had refused to do Rwanda's bidding and forced out foreign troops in the DRC, Rwanda retaliated by backing rebel groups like RCD, Rally for Congolese Democracy, and MLC, Movement for the Liberation of Congo, that sought to overthrow Kabila. The result was a very bloody war that dragged on to 2003 and only ended when Kabila's son entered peace agreements with Rwanda and Uganda. Oh, because yeah, Laurent Kabila was assassinated by his own bodyguards in 2001, and because the wheels just gotta keep on turning, he was very quickly replaced by his son, Joseph Kabila. Now, my video could have ended here, but sadly, the end of the Second Congo War didn't signal the beginning of an era of peace for the country. In fact, instability and violence in the DRC, specifically Eastern DRC, continued after the formal withdrawal of foreign forces. Due to the arming and counter-arming of rebel militias and foreign entities, there are still between 120 to 140 rebel groups actively operating in the east and northeast areas of the country. Incidentally, those areas are also very resource-rich, which, as we've seen from all of the history I laid out in this video, only spells trouble.
Eastern Congo is one of the world's top 5 producers of coltan, a mineral essential to the production of laptops, tablets, and cell phones. Prices for coltan are soaring, making the mines high-value targets for different rebel groups. These groups raid the mines and then use the spoils to buy weapons and supplies.
In fact, after decades of mass murders, terror, exploitation, and land seizure, the Congolese are still victims of imperialism, international greed, and war. So on top of the millions upon millions that lost their lives under King Leopold's rule, about 6 million Congolese lives have also been claimed due to the ongoing conflicts. Conflicts that, it bears repeating, have been manufactured by outside forces. See, DRC is home to some of the world's largest reserves of metals and rare earth minerals like cobalt. In fact, more than 70% of the world's cobalt cobalt supply comes from the DRC, which in turn makes everything from your phones to your PlayStations. And because our world is more reliant than ever on minerals like cobalt, local and external groups are essentially being incentivized to get involved and battle for control over these resources. But what this also means is that, as in the past, innocent Congolese civilians are bearing the brunt of these bloody conflicts.
This is one of the thousands of unregulated, unmonitored mines in the DRC. It's crawling with children, working like modern-day slaves. Although one of the poorest countries on Earth, DRC is rich in minerals. But a history of brutal colonial exploitation looks like being repeated. Much of it's mined by hand, with rudimentary tools in harsh, potentially hazardous conditions.
Due to armed groups like M23, which has been found to be backed by Rwanda despite repeated denials, nearly 7 million people have been internally displaced, ripped from their families, or had their villages wiped out. In fact, what's happening today in large parts of the Congo amounts to a genocide driven by economic interests and propelled by the illegal exploitation of mines, which bring in money to fund wars, and so on and so forth. The cycle continues.
Congo's neighbors, Rwanda and Uganda, have fueled instability here for decades, backing proxy militias in order to illegally extract minerals like coltan and gold. Rwanda is the world's third largest coltan exporter, even though Rwanda has no industrial coltan mines. Rwanda denies meddling in Congo, but its support of M23 was confirmed by a leaked UN report with photos of Rwandan troops crossing into Congo and M23 fighters with Rwandan army uniforms and weapons. These links mean the conflict risks spiraling into a regional war that plays out along ethnic lines. Fighting between the army and M23 has displaced over 500,000 Congolese people in just a few months. The National Army, along with the 15,000-strong UN peacekeeping force, haven't been able to stop the rebels from taking critical territory.
And with all of this, I haven't even touched on the spread of famine, diseases, abductions, and physical and sexual exploitation of children.
J'ai travaillé ici pendant plus maintenant de 32 ans. Je n'avais jamais vu ce que je vois aujourd'hui. Jamais. Aujourd'hui, on voit le nombre d'enfants violés qui augmente et je pense que ça, c'est un phénomène qu'on doit absolument comprendre.
Wanakuambia tuko na amani. Mesie huku chini. Niveau lokale amani yetu iko wapi? Uhuru ya kuishi Mkongo. Mama atakuwa pamoja na mama wote wa Kongo mali watajikuta wanarudia maisha yao ya zamani. Tulikuwa bakondifa na tuko na sana mtu alikuwa tupitisha mbele. Sisi tunajua kama sisi wa mama wa Kongo. Tulikuwa na Valer.
I do mention it because it needs to be known, but I won't get into details because I find it to be personally triggering. However, I'll link all of my sources to this video, as well as resources that can give you a more in-depth look at what has happened and what's been happening. Ultimately, time and time again, the DRC has been a casualty of greed and really a prisoner of its own wealth. External players have continuously used humanitarian or political pretexts to push their own agendas within the country.
More obstacles to peace in Democratic Republic of Congo.
Kila mtu anajua kama ni mtu aleta. Akisha kuona tunanyenere ni frank.
Where there's corruption, development can't exist.
They have definitely had outside help.
The main power is the power of the gun.
Na wale ambayo wangeweza kutusaidia ndio walifanya mambo.
Pour nous, on a un message, la patrie ou la mort nous vaincront, et on ne libère pas un peuple se libère. La paix ne viendra pas des Kenyans, la paix ne viendra pas des Ougandais ou des Burundais. La paix ne viendra que du peuple congolais. Et c'est aujourd'hui ou jamais, le peuple se lève pour dire non à ce complot international contre notre pays.
So, to paint the Congo as a land of violence without taking into consideration all of its history is simply wrong. We can't dismiss the way in which colonial violence was built into Congolese structures and still reverberates throughout the lives of the Congolese today. In the case of the DRC, the most horrific forms of cruelty were born out of the colonial institution and maintained by post-colonial states or authoritarian leaders that focused on the extraction of resources at the expense of local populations. How can a country prosper in these conditions? How does a country free itself of those tight shackles? Really, on my end, part of what I can do is talk about it, just like many others have been doing online. I chose to speak on the DRC today because the factors that led to the current crisis often go unmentioned. It also touches me personally because not only was my paternal grandmother born there, but my dad grew up there and I lived there for a couple of years. Now, granted, I was in Kinshasa, the capital, so not really affected by all the violence in the eastern region, but turning a blind eye when something doesn't affect you directly is callous, senseless, and frankly wrong. So with that, here are a number of organizations and fundraisers that you can help support, as well as documentaries that you can watch to familiarize yourself a bit more with what's happening in the Congo. Now, I know that this video was a bit different from all of my other ones so far, and perhaps a bit more uncomfortable, but I'm actually thinking of doing a bit more of these deep dives, so let me know in the comments if that's something that interests you. But yeah, that's it for me, folks. If you like this video, don't hesitate to like or comment. I'm a budding channel, so any show of support is really appreciated. And with that, have a great day or night, and I'll see you next time. Bye!